Good evening, everyone. I thought I would start the show this week with a little trailer for our Festival of Economics taking place in Dundee in less than 2 weeks. That was instead of our normal introduction. Thanks very much for joining us. We seem to be having a little bit of problem with Facebook. So we've just got viewers from Twitter and YouTube at the moment. I'll see what I can do about that, because it's always good to hear from those watching the show on Facebook. Well, tonight we're going to talk with James Plunkett, and we're going to cover some of the issues in his book, and we're also going to talk about inequality, and he's written some fantastic pieces on inequality. So we've got a great interview with James coming up. Episode 68 of SCOTONOMICS. So thanks so much if you've stuck with us right from the start, and hello and welcome to you if you're watching us for the first time. And someone contacted me and said, can we have a little look at that picture that's often behind you, because we can't quite see what it is. So I'm going to do that right now. So it's an old map of London, and I think it was in Jane Austen's London. My partner and my partner's from Essex, and we met in London. That's why we've got that in our flat in Dundee. So for the two people who've asked me over the last few weeks what that is, that's what it is. Anyway, on to the topic for tonight. So James has written a fantastic book, which is called End State, and it's looking at how we fix our broken state. You're really going to enjoy this interview tonight. It's about 48 minutes long. We've, of course, got an extended version on our Patreon. We actually asked James what he thought around the just transition and degrowth and other elements of that, kind of the importance of growth to an economy, and that's available on our Patreon. We cut that out just to make tonight's episode a little bit shorter. Please do say hello throughout the show and give us your comments. That's always really interesting to see. I hope you enjoy this. James, an incredibly intelligent guy, a lot of really, really good ideas, and certainly a few ideas for us to look at the way that we run our economy very differently. I hope you enjoy the show and look forward to hearing from you as it progresses. James Plunkett, welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Thank you so much for doing this interview for us today. I just want to dive straight into our first question, because I've really enjoyed reading your book, End State. Now, there's one big question in the book, and it is, does our economy, as it currently governed, enable most people to live their life to the full? Now, I'd like the audience to think about that as we talk through the topics we're going to cover today, because I think the framing's perfect, because isn't that what we all want? And shouldn't that be the bare minimum, an economy that works for us all? So if the economy isn't delivering this bare minimum, can you give us your overview of the areas that you think are broken?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a big question, I think, and it's the one my book explores. I think the big story I'm telling, I suppose, in the book is this sense that the state has, or the way in which we govern society has fallen behind and has failed to keep up with the way in which the world's changing. And I look, I suppose, through the lens of technology and the way in which technology is transforming our economy and our society, but you could look through other lenses. And it's really about this sense that the world has changed profoundly in the last 20, 30 years, and we haven't seen equivalent changes in the way in which we govern our society and economy. So I look through different, I guess, elements of the way in which the state works. So, one example would be social security and the way in which we give workers security in their lives. It's pretty clear that the kind of jobs people do have changed profoundly, that many people are now not employed in the traditional way we might have expected. The rise of the gig economy, the rise of new forms of contract, 0 hours contract, for example. And those new forms of work really do not dovetail with the way in which the welfare system is designed. So, you find if you're an Uber driver trying to claim universal credit, the system just wasn't designed for that kind of form of work, right? It was designed for waged employment, in which someone might fall sick for a period of months and would claim support and then move back into work. So it's designed for a model of work that is 100 years old or more. And that's just one example, really. I look at other, if you like, sort of pillars of the state. So another example would be economic regulation. The way that we regulate markets, again, was designed for a pre-digital world. It doesn't work for the likes of Facebook and Google and the new sort of pervasive manipulation we see of decision making by consumers online. It can't cope with these big monopolies of big tech, and competition authorities are struggling. So you just see, I think, across the piece, when you look at those areas, when you look at healthcare and the way in which today's healthcare problems are so different from the kind of problems the healthcare system was designed to solve decades ago, that we've fallen behind. And I talk about this gap, governance gap, if you like, opening up. And I think across the piece, there's a sort of upgrading to be done, where the question I ask really is, if you built the state from scratch today, what would you build? And I think you'd build something really quite different from the state we've inherited from the 20th century.
That's 20, 30 years when you've said there that things are very different from where we were in, let's say, the 80s or the 90s. But actually in the book, you compare, and you start with your comparison from about 150 years ago, and you compare the challenges we face now as we move to like a digitalized version of capitalism. And you compare that to the birth of industrial capitalism. Can you outline the similarities and the social ills that you can see between those two very different times in history?
So I've always liked this phrase, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think that holds in this comparison of the digital revolution and the industrial revolution. I remember when I was starting out on the path of writing my book, and it didn't set out to be an optimistic book. I set out to write about the big problems we face. But then I had this moment when I was researching, where I went into one of those lovely secondhand bookshops on the Charing Cross Road in London, and I stumbled on this book, which was a collection of newspaper articles and letters and diary entries from the time of the Industrial Revolution. And it was from about the years 1840 to 1870. And I sat in this bookshop and I started reading this book. And the thing that made the hair sort of stand up on the back of my neck was this sense of similarity, that when you looked at the kind of sense of crisis and this sort of sense that things were spinning out of control that developed in that mid-19th century period, when the economy was being changed profoundly by technology. In that case, it was industrialization, the rise of factory employment, urbanization, the problems that flowed from that, like not least sewage in the big cities, for example, was the kind of big problem of the time. And there was this sense, and you see this in newspaper articles and in letters people wrote to the newspapers at the time, that people were feeling their government had lost its grip, and that government was kind of proving incapable of governing this new economy that was emerging. And the funny thing is, the reason that left me actually feeling quite hopeful is that what we did in response to industrialization in the end was we built a new kind of state. We built a whole new architecture that was capable of governing an industrial economy. And so, we did things like lay public sewage systems to cope with, the kind of challenges of urbanization. We built vast amounts of housing. We established eventually the NHS to deal with the kind of health challenges of a modern economy. We established social security to help people in those jobs to be secure as they move through their lives. We did things like ban child labor from factories. And so actually, when you zoom out enough, you get this story of the world changes as a result of technology, and then we adapted the state in response. And I started to think, really, that is what we now need to do in response to the digital revolution, is have a similarly profound process of adapting the state so it's capable of governing this new kind of economy. And I think we've done it before, if you like, and we can do it again, although it's a process of decades, not years.
And that might be the difference, that the things that you listed wasn't a few years or even a couple of decades. It was a much longer period of time. And I think the technological change didn't change so rapidly that the state was able to catch up or stay only a few months or years behind, whereas the level of technological progress now, it's much harder for the state to kind of stay just behind the technological progress. And I'm thinking about, automation, robotics and artificial intelligence. These things seems to change so rapidly that speed of response from the state has surely got to be much faster than it was, 150 years ago.
I think that's right. Yeah, and I think one of the worries, particularly on problems like climate change, where you reach tipping points and you get to the point where it's too late, and however fast you catch up, it's just too late because certain dynamics have kicked in. So I do think that point about we've got to be far more agile, if you want to use that word, in the way we respond. I would say, though, if you look back at the Industrial Revolution, it's striking how long it took us to get to grips with what we now think of as kind of, obvious responses to these problems. So one of the stories I like the best from that period is this situation that became known as the Gauge Wars, where when we first laid the railway tracks across Britain, they were laid at these two different gauges. And so because there was no standardized gauge for railway tracks, we ended up with essentially two different railway networks that couldn't connect. And so wherever a train sort of had to pass between these railway networks, you had to get off one train for a wide gauge and get onto another train for a narrow gauge. And that problem, although it now seems to us obvious, of course there should be a single gauge for railway tracks. Of course we should have standardized approaches to those kinds of physical infrastructure. The Gauge Wars, as they called them at the time, ran on for about 60 years. And only then did we get to this kind of very obvious solution that you should have economic regulation and you should standardize railway tracks in that example. So I do think we've got a track record of taking quite a long time to put in place what seem in hindsight obvious solutions. And I suspect we might see some of that play out this time as well.
You've identified some of the issues there. And I think that, if you're talking about similar issues, lack of housing, real issues with the environment from the industrial age to where we are now, also a welfare and a benefit system that doesn't quite cope. If those are 3 or 4 of the areas, how do we start to fix those problems?
Yeah, I mean, the $1 million question, I think it's really interesting how much we seem, or throughout history, how much we've relied on crises. And it's quite, I guess, a bit, one of the sobering notes that comes out from the book is, if you do look at these problems we encountered in the 19th century, for example, the problems tended to get pretty bad before we got our act together, if you like. So, the sewage on the banks of the Thames, for example, that built up until we had an adequate public sewage system was 6 feet to 2 meters deep before we acted. And the only reason in that case that MPs got their act together was that Parliament happens to be on the banks of the Thames, and it smelt pretty bad in Parliament by that point. And so Disraeli eventually helped to steer through a bill to build the embankments in London and a proper sewage system. So the sewage gets pretty deep, if you like, before we act. And often there's this kind of dynamic, I guess, that plays out that I sometimes refer to as a mudslide dynamic, where social problems build up. It becomes more and more obvious that there's this sort of accumulation of problems. And then at some point there's a rainstorm in the form of some kind of crisis that triggers the mudslide of change. And suddenly, often when that happens, you see, as we did in the post-war decades in Britain, a very quick, sudden amount of change. And actually change can be suddenly very quick, having not happened for many decades. So there's this sort of dynamic of not enough change and then suddenly lots coming at once that happens in politics, which is messy, is frustrating, and creates this sort of real volatility, I think. But I mean, one of the really interesting questions is sort of, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to wait for a crisis? And how do we try to make our systems of governance and our systems of the state less dependent on crises to reform themselves? And I do think I close the book with a chapter on sort of change and the way government functions, and getting into things like, what does it look like to have a more agile state, to try to test as we go, to try to iterate policy, to try to experiment more and try out radically new things and then scale them up if they're working. And that's quite a different mindset to bring to what is still, I think, quite a sort of waterfall, old-fashioned approach to public policy that we have today. But there's a lot of those new ways of working, I think, that are sort of central to the response to this challenge.
The other point I wanted to make was thinking about when you were reading that book or those series of letters in the bookshop, and you're looking ahead and saying, wow, these problems were the same. Last year I read The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, and I think that was written in the late 19th century, and that could have been written 3 weeks ago, with just names and the occupations changes, but the problems were all very similar. And I read a book last year called The Street by Ann Petrie, which is a fantastic book set in the States. And again, that could have been written 3 weeks ago. So when you're saying that we've kind of solved these problems before, I would come back and say, well, actually, the problems are still there. there's just a nuance and they're slightly different, but we haven't really solved those problems of lack of housing, huge amounts of inequality, poor jobs, and poor working conditions and poor living conditions from that 150 years to where we are now. Would you accept that? Or
I think I'm, I suppose I'm an optimist in some senses on this. And, if you look over let's say 150-year period to 1870, life expectancy, for example, has doubled and in some cases trebled across the whole of Britain, pretty much, and actually across much of the developed world. In fact, most of the world has seen huge leaps, a doubling or even a trebling in life expectancy. And that is because, we got a handle on what was the big killer of the time, which was communicable disease. And we did that by building public health systems and by spreading an understanding of sanitation, clean water, healthcare systems that were able to prescribe medicines, antibiotics, and so on. And so I think healthcare is a good example of how it's not quite the same problem that we face now. Take your point on certain issues where we failed to make progress, but if you take healthcare, the really sizable burden of disease, as people sometimes call it, today is around mental health, is around chronic conditions that affect people throughout their lives in fluctuating ways. And it is not, diphtheria and typhoid and the kind of communicable disease that we built systems to respond to 150 or 100 years ago. And so, it's a really good example because in healthcare, for example, what kind of systems do you need to help people with mental health or with chronic conditions? It's very different actually from the kind of, prescribe a pill or prescribe an operation systems that we built to tackle those earlier physical, more acute physical, communicable conditions. And so you need to certainly not slide backwards, I think, on some of those earlier challenges, as we've seen with COVID. Clearly those communicable disease can still be a major threat to our well-being, but we need to build new systems that are more capable in that case of helping people manage chronic conditions, manage their mental health, manage their well-being in the round and the lifestyle factors. And I think that point that in so many cases the problem has changed, the kind of character of the problem has changed, and the character of the policy response needs to change in response.
The character of the response is one thing, but also the makeup and the design of the institutions is crucially important as well. What's your thoughts on that institutional development of the state and of the main institutions of this? We are living in a very different world. Do we have the institutional setup to cope with that?
I think it's emerging. I think this I keep having the sense of kind of the future state, if you like, for want of a better phrase. So let's say this, what will the government look like in 2050? I think we can't quite see it yet, but there's something kind of emerging from the fog, if that makes sense. And I think it's not that different to the world in, let's say, the early 20th century, when a whole range of reformers at that time were starting to think through what kind of state might we need to respond to the challenges of that moment. And we ended up with what we came to call social democracy, the social democratic settlement, the post-war settlement. If you'd asked someone to predict what that kind of mid-20th century state would look like in, say, 1910, they would have got some things right. They would have got a lot wrong. And I suspect we're at a similar place of, what kind of institutions do we need? What kind of state do we need in, say, 30 years' time? I think some things that are emerging and are becoming clearer is that it seems to me it needs to be a less technocratic state, if that makes sense. I do think there's something quite common to a lot of the systems that we built in the sort of early to mid 20th century. They were they were the classic sort of big bureaucracy. They were hierarchical Whitehall departments is the sort of emblematic example. The NHS itself is a big bureaucratic hierarchy, sort of almost Fordist in the way it functions. The welfare system we've built is ever more technocratic. It's very complicated to deal with. It has all these rules and criteria that mean that when you interact with it, it's confusing. It doesn't feel particularly empowering. It leaves you feeling not very good about yourself, leaves you feeling sort of done to rather than done with. And I think, when people try to describe this future type of government, they tend to describe something that's, I suppose, sort of more human, simpler, kind of warmer. Some people use the word relational to describe this future state, that it's it cares more about how people feel. It cares more about the quality of human relationships. It cares more about communities and well-being in the round, and not just about sort of illness. It cares about well-being as opposed to just illness. And I think that's pretty impressionistic, because, as I say, this thing is still emerging, I think. But I think you're starting to see
very hazy picture, that, isn't it?
It's a hazy picture. It's a hazy picture as it would have been sort of in the 20th century, but it's starting to emerge. And I think, the key thing is we need to build it. It's not just going to emerge if we sit and wait. So we have to sort of lean into that, try and work out what it looks like and build it together.
And can you think of any examples where that's happening already? I mean, I'm thinking of the community wealth building movement, and I think it's the Preston model, and there's some anchor institutions, and there are some kind of green shoots for a slightly different way to run our economy and our society. Can you think of any other examples?
I think something that's fascinating at this moment in politics is, on the one hand, there's this sort of gloomy sense that politics is broken, and if you look at the sort of, the upper echelons of our political realm, don't feel like they're working particularly well. There's sort of deadwood, right? There's kind of seems like a lack of ideas, a lack of boldness, a lack of vision. But if you look at the edges of the system, if you like, the periphery of the system, so kind of local services, local community-run projects, the frontier of academic research, there's this almost a renaissance of new ideas and new approaches. And you named some examples there. I think I would name the kind of experiments in relational public services, where people build community-based healthcare, community-based mental health services. Amazing results from some of these kind of approaches where you help people in groups rather than individually to help to manage a chronic condition, or to group counselling approaches, for example, incredibly effective. And I think a lot of these new ideas are happening at the front line, if you like. And there's a funny thing about our system, that it's sort of died from the centre out. And actually, there's a lot of life. There's almost kind of new buds growing around the edges in some of these local experiments. And as you say, lots of them are very place-based. I think is really fascinating that a lot of these experiments are about saying, what if you look through place as the lens and say, what would it look like to have a more joined up approach to the services in this local area, as opposed to the sort of the old approach, which is sort of the Whitehall silo centralized department. So there's just a big question for me about how do you sort of almost absorb some of that energy and centralize some of the, bring some of that energy into the system from the edges, as opposed to trying to sort of push out ideas from this kind of, pretty old-fashioned center. Yeah,
I remember when I was studying politics at university, and I was studying the European community, as it was at that point, and the main kind of rationale for the European community was that this idea of subsidiarity, and that Europe would only take on power where it was most relevant, and so should the state. And through this century, I haven't seen this idea of subsidiarity seems to have disappeared. It's certainly disappeared in the UK, where we have a very centralised state. In Westminster, in Scotland, we have, I would suggest, even a more centralised state. And this idea of making decisions at the closest level to the people who are impacted by those decisions seems to have disappeared. Have you seen any kind of renaissance in this idea of subsidiarity? And
I think we need that, because I think there's something very interesting. The word devolution, there's a bit of renewed interest in the question of devolution in all its different contexts. I do think there's a funny thing that's happened with devolution the last sort of decade or so, where if you get devolution wrong, it becomes a sort of almost like a dismantling, right? It becomes a kind of the thing that we've been devolving, it seems to me, in the last 10 years is sort of, we devolve problems rather than power, right? There's this sort of sense of, let's pass the buck down to local authorities, for example. Let's devolve these problems, but not really to devolve the power to address them. And I think that there is a real value, I think, and it would be very timely to have a new conversation about devolution that is more in that space of subsidiarity, because it seems to me that there are some things that are too decentralized. So, I would point to the example of the way in which we use technology. Across the UK, the number of different local, for example, planning systems there is this enormous duplication in the sort of underlying technologies that we use to govern. And And that seems to me just a case of duplication and mess and fragmentation, when you could build shared systems on which to do things like, planning, community engagement, identity verification, and so on. So there's cases where we want to centralize, I think, and share more platforms. And then there's cases, more as you described, where you do want to push the actual what matters, which is decision making and power and autonomy, down to communities. So it's quite a complex picture, and I think we need to kind of refresh our view of what devolution really means for the way in which the world now works. And I think if we do that, that can be a real unlocking force. It can unlock a lot of that energy that's in communities. But if you get it wrong, it becomes a kind of, fragmentation, a duplication, and a sort of dismantling, which is where I think more where we've been for the last 10 years or so.
And that leads nicely into the idea of the United Kingdom as the state. Do you think the UK is a failed state?
I think we have, I don't know if I'd go quite as far as to call the UK a failed state, but I do think it's, what might you call it, an outdated state, or it's a state or a settlement, if you like, that functioned, I think, pretty well for us for a number of decades, in that particularly that kind of late 20th century period, and proved capable of making great progress, I think, on a number of really significant challenges. Certainly, again, if you zoom out to 150 year time frame, that's when you start to see, we have made meaningful, sustained and sustainable progress on some profound social challenges around healthcare, around protecting consumers, around the way in which we regulate markets, even around the way in which we give people security through their working lives. The question for me is, has that model, has that settlement run its course, and do we now need a new one? And I personally think that's what we're starting to run into as we get deeper into the 21st century, is, a settlement that worked pretty well for us for a number of decades has sort of run its natural life, and we now need something new. And I think, in the context of devolution, I think that word subsidiarity is a good one, albeit it's a slightly sort of technical term, that this question of at what level of the system should you make decisions. And as I say, for me, that is not just about purely a sort of decentralization agenda, because for me, some things now should be more central than they were before, not least technical standards, sharing of data, for example, sharing of technology infrastructure. But within that, you do want to have a model in which you have autonomy, right? And you devolve decision making closer to the people that decisions affect. And I think that feels, we said earlier, how do you describe the future state? I think one thing we can say with quite a lot of confidence is that the state in 2050 will be a more decentralized state that gives people more autonomy than the state as we know it today.
You're talking about looking to 2050. If we look back and there had been a different state, one of the easiest things to do is look back 30 years. So going back to 1990, 1995, is the state and is the government that different from 95 to where we are now, 30 years later?
I think one of the most telling things is how similar our settlement is now to 30 years ago. And if you think, when you step back and think how profoundly the world has changed, particularly as a result of technology in that period, but really when we look through our systems, of course, there's been, incremental changes, and of course we've moved money around, and certain aspects of the state have shifted. Certainly, for example, the proportion of public money we spend on healthcare has risen. New challenges have emerged around aging, for example, and social care and so on. But really, when it comes down to the sort of, if you like, the how rather than the what, so the kind of, how does the state function? How do we do policy making? How does Whitehall operate? How do we design policies and implement them? Really, a lot of those methodologies have been pretty consistent, not just back to the mid-90s, but even decades before that. And I think, it's not a surprise that when you look at the kind of frontier of the commercial sector, the private sector, the companies that have been founded in the last 10 years are unrecognizable from the way in which companies used to function. The way that Uber operates, the way in which Google operates, the culture at a company like Spotify, are completely unrecognizable from the traditional corporation or the way companies functioned in the early 90s. So that's not to say we should emulate all of that, because there's much that we know is is problematic about those cultures, but not to learn from the new practices and the new ways in which companies use technology seems to me like tying our hands behind our back. So, I do think it troubles me that the states that look so similar to, if you like, before the internet emerged. And it seems to me we're not going to get out of this pickle until the state looks pretty different, and frankly probably looks quite a lot more like some of these frontier organizations that are able to use technology so much more effectively. Because
that's exactly how I feel. I don't feel like there's much, I worked in Westminster. I know you worked in Westminster Number 10. I worked in the Parliament for a year, and I know if I went back there 25 years later, it looks exactly the same. The structure's completely the same. So where does your optimism that I've got to say flows through your book, this optimism that things can and will change, where does this come from? Because, just that one example, well, 30 years ago, we've hardly had any meaningful development. And I think we've got to be looking at a kind of paradigm shift, not just this has changed a little bit or we've given a little bit more money to there. So tell me, because I need some right now, where does that optimism come from?
It really comes from zooming out. And I think, yeah, as I say, when I set out to write my book, I wasn't intending to write an optimistic book, and it was that when you zoom out and you look at the long term of social change, that's for me when you start to spot this mudslide dynamic, and you start to see that what happens repeatedly is this sense that kind of a need for change builds up and accumulates and becomes more and more self-evident, and then there is this kind of unlocking. And it's, as we said earlier, it's very hard to predict which rainstorm will it be that triggers the mudslide is really hard to predict, but everyone can see the mud that's mounted up on the hillside. And I think it's quite hard to deny we're at a sort of moment that feels like that. It feels like this sense of sort of accumulated need for change, and it doesn't, that cannot stand, if you like. That's what the dynamic tells us. The other dynamic I think gives me some hope is this repeated pattern that is fascinating in politics, where new ideas emerge that everyone says are radical, unaffordable, unthinkable, and then they become common sense within a matter of decades. And we see this throughout history with free education, the NHS, the idea of social security, the idea of public housing, economic regulation, competition policy. I mean, you could just list the different elements of the modern state. All of those were considered to be radical, unaffordable, dangerous acts of government overreach. Public sewage systems were called a dangerous act of government overreach when they were first mooted. And then, of course, as soon as these things happen, people nod along as if we've always known they should happen. And so, and this is one of the premises for the book, is what this tells us is that there will be ideas out there today that people currently think are unaffordable, radical, and the height of kind of radicalism, that will in 20 years time be common sense. And it seems to me myopic to not think that's the case. And so the interesting question is not really will that happen, because I think it's pretty clear that will happen. That dynamic is ongoing. It's kind of, what are those ideas, and is there anything we can do to speed up the process by which they become accepted as the new common sense? So that gives me a lot of hope. It's kind of, the more you zoom out, the more hopeful you feel, I think.
I noticed when you were saying about the arguments being used, and that when we were trying to ban child labour, the same argument was made for when we were trying to introduce a minimum wage. You can just see those, it will impact the market, and people will have to raise prices and there'll be a lot less jobs. There was all of these kind of arguments being made. But yeah, as you said, it seems radical, but it just seems really normal now. And when I was reading it, I was kind of reminded of that Keynes quote that says, anything we can do, we can afford. What is your thoughts on this idea that we can afford what we want? Because some of the ideas you've come up with in the book, the easy reaction is to say, well, who pays for that? Where does the money come from?
Yeah, and there's another quote as well I love from Keynes that's about you need to start with the ethics and then bring in the economics. And he made that comment in a letter he wrote, thinking about how should you imagine the future? How should you think about long-term social change? And it's very interesting, this concept that if you'd started with the economics, if you like, was the NHS affordable? As it turned out to be in the mid 1940s. If you'd sat down and sort of costed the NHS, if you like, in the manner of an accountant and said, can we afford this? Do we have the spare money? It's not clear. The answer would have been yes. That's not really how the public finances work. It's not that you identify here is an amount of spare money with which we will build the NHS. It's almost the other way around, that you flesh out this vision for where you're trying to get to, and then you incrementally get there. And that in itself unlocks some of the revenue streams, some of the growth and productivity impacts that then end up paying for the reforms. And so there's a very interesting dynamic that plays out, again, I've noticed in social change, where often change comes from an argument about ethics as opposed to economics. And again, this was very clearly the case with the ban on child labour. I say in the book, we didn't ban child labour on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis. And arguably, if you'd done the pure sort of Treasury-style cost-benefit analysis at the time, maybe you wouldn't have banned child labour, because industry was heavily dependent on child labour. But we said this is the right thing to do. This is an ethical imperative, and we worked out how to do it. And the economics, if you like, flowed from there, and the market adjusted. And of course it did, because it had to. And so there's this sense in which we sometimes get this round the wrong way, and we put the sort of economics before the ethics. And I do think it's a good kind of reminder from Keynes that you start with the kind of society you want and believe to be ethically necessary, and then work through the economics after that. And I think that's, it's something we often get wrong.
I would just add a distinction there, that we're not talking about the financing, because what we're saying is we can finance anything. We're talking about the resources that are available. And I think the NHS is a perfect example. When we created that, we looked at the United Kingdom and we thought we can finance it because we're monetary sovereign, but we don't have the resources. We've got to go to the West Indies and bring in hundreds of thousands of workers to support our National Health Service. If we want public transport, we've got to bring in more resources to resource that. And that's where I think we just, when we're talking about economics, we too often get caught up in the money to pay for things and not the resources. And I think, again, I highlighted a section in your book where you said that we need economists who can move beyond the orthodoxy to look at new ideas. And you mentioned behavioural economics. And the book covers a lot of ideas and theories that are outside the orthodoxy, and it challenges the orthodoxy, which is what we do on the show. And I just wonder what made you take that, unfortunately, quite radical approach to solutions, not to base it in this economic orthodoxy.
I think there's, in a way, economics is another example of a discipline, if you like, that's in need of modernization. But to be fair, when you look into academia, the energy and momentum is behind more heterodox approaches. As you reference behavioral economics, huge energy, fascinating work being done in the field of behavioral science, in the field of complexity science, and in the field of, for example, a much more pragmatic economics that is more rooted in experiments, which is quite different to the sort of, if you like, the more neoclassical, more theoretical approach that was dominant in at least the sort of 1990s. And so I do think, it's true that the kind of economics we apply in the kind of heart of public policy hasn't really caught up with that yet, and there's a sort of lag in that we're still, I think, applying as much as we sometimes tell ourselves we're not. We're still, I think, in the main, working from quite orthodox assumptions in the economics we apply in most of public policy. Not least because a lot of the toolkit that we've developed is tied to those assumptions around, the way in which we do cost-benefit analysis, the way in which we calculate net present value of investments, etc. So I do think it will take time for, if you like, public policy to catch up in the economics it applies. But for me, actually, that I was just going with where the energy is in academia, in a more academic economics, which is behind these more heterodox approaches. And there's just incredibly good evidence now that these kinds of approaches can be highly effective. And so in a way, it's about public policy catching up with where economics in the academic world has already got to.
Well, that's really interesting. So you were just looking for evidence to base your suggestions, and it seemed like heterodox economics is where they would be found. You wrote a really fascinating series of articles, which I think tell me if I'm wrong, I've tried to summarize, looks to kind of reframe the idea of inequality. And you were saying, let's call it inequality. But can you briefly cover why you think it's essential to reframe how we measure, how we see, and I think importantly, how we react to inequality?
I think there's just another example, inequality. Inequality is a very entrenched concept. It's obviously such a central concept to particularly people in progressive politics or on the left. And I think what's happened with inequality is it's changed before our eyes. And I don't think our conception of inequality has caught up with that. And you see this if you look at the data on inequality, I guess the sort of core metrics that we use to understand inequality. Everyone thinks inequality is higher than ever, is rising, is a central problem. If you look actually at the main measures we use, so ratios like the 90-10 ratio of income or earnings, the Gini coefficient, most of these measures of inequality have been flat pretty much for 10 or 20 years, with some variation around the edges. But what's going on there when we feel that inequality is such a profound problem? I think the answer is inequality isn't rising as we traditionally conceived it. It's changing. And when you dig into some of the more contemporary research around inequality, you see these fascinating changes in, for example, the geography of inequality. So, for example, good jobs and growth are becoming much more tightly clustered around technology clusters. Hence, cities like London and San Francisco have this sort of astronomical wealth and these incredibly highly paid jobs, while other regions fall behind. You see a kind of almost an experiential type of inequality that's emerged, where there's this sense that some people are sort of involved in the future and building the future, and some people are being left behind in the past. And it seems to me that, I guess, the kind of thing that inequality has changed. And I think our policy response has to change as a result. So, to characterize a bit crudely, in the past, we felt that, let's say in response to 1980s style inequality, what we could do is redistribute. So we could have a tax and benefit system that essentially taxed the rich and moved some money to people lower down the income distribution. But when you're dealing with inequality as we see it today, where it's this very geographical type of inequality, it's very based around status and esteem and people's place in the future. It seems to me just moving some money around, just taxing London and redistributing isn't enough, because it doesn't really speak to this central question of, is our economy working for people, and do people feel like they're part of what we're building, and do people feel like they're part of it, part of opportunity, in a way that gives them self-esteem and feel part of the future. And you can't just redistribute your way to that. You can't redistribute your way to that as a problem. So I think we need a kind of a response that is much more about how people feel and is much more about the geography of inequality, and that really gets deeper into the question of how the economy works and doesn't just compensate for the kind of dysfunctions that we're seeing. So it's a big change, and I think it's one progressives and people on the left in particular need to grapple with.
And again, that's much more of a changing the rules of the game, or a paradigm shift, than it is just tweaking the numbers and the figures and where little bits of money are going. Well, it was great that you ended with that question, because that's how we started. James, thank you so much. I hope that it's a little bit clearer for us, the problems that we've got. But I really like that you are positive, and we're looking ahead, and we've identified some of the areas where we can hopefully make a change. And I think we're both agreeing that it's about, maybe you won't use the word radical, but it's about systemic change, and it's about making big changes. And we've got to do that over the next couple of decades if we really do want to fix our broken state. James, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.